She tossed my pillows down the stairs and laughed. "The basement is your room now." She treated me like a dog in the home I built. She forgot one detail. I'm not the guest. I'm the landlord, and her eviction starts now. The afternoon sun was struggling to pierce through the heavy gray clouds over Greenwich, casting a pale, clinical light into my dining room. I sat there, my spine as straight as the heirloom silver on the table, watching the steam rise from my Earl Grey. I didn't need a mirror to know my face was a mask of practiced composure, a gift, or perhaps a curse, from 40 years of marriage to a man who built empires. Across from me, Sarah adjusted her Cartier watch. The gold clinked against the glass tabletop, a sharp, artificial sound that seemed to shatter the silence I had spent all morning cultivating. She hadn't touched her tea. To her, this house was no longer a home, it was an asset, and I was merely an outdated piece of furniture. "Eleanor," she began, her voice devoid of the warmth she used to fake when we first met. She didn't look at me. She was staring at the architectural blueprints spread out where my husband used to read the morning paper. "We've been reviewing the floor plans for the renovation. With the new nursery and my home office, space is becoming an issue." I took a slow, measured sip. The tea was bitter, just the way I needed it to be. "Go on, Sarah. We've decided to convert your current suite into a wellness and yoga studio," she said, finally meeting my eyes. There was no hesitation there, only a cold, calculated ambition. "It has the best morning light. We've already arranged for the movers to come tomorrow. You'll be moving your things to the basement suite. It's quiet, private, and quite efficient." The basement. The word hung in the air like a sentence. I looked at my son, Mark, sitting at the head of the table. My son, the boy I had stayed up with through every fever. The man whose first business venture I had quietly funded with my own inheritance. He was focused on his plate, his knife and fork moving with mechanical precision, dissecting a piece of sea bass as if his life depended on it. He wouldn't look up. He wouldn't meet the gaze of the mother who had given him everything. "The basement, Sarah?" I asked, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "It's where we used to store the things we didn't want to see anymore. Old holiday decorations, broken chairs, dust." Sarah offered a thin, practiced smile. "It's been fully finished, Eleanor. It's modern. Besides, it's closer to the laundry room and the service entrance. Since you've been wanting to stay active, we thought you could help manage the household staff more directly. It's a win-win." A win-win. The language of a corporate takeover. I looked around the room at the crown molding I had personally designed, at the fireplace where Mark had opened his Christmas presents for 25 years. They thought they were moving me to the cellar to hide me away. They thought that by taking away my light, they would extinguish my spirit. What they forgot was that I am the one who knows where the foundations are buried. I am the one who knows that this house doesn't breathe without me. They saw a tired widow. They didn't see the woman who still held the keys to the kingdom they were so desperately trying to claim. "The basement," I repeated softly, setting my cup down with a deliberate, silent touch. "I suppose that's where the most important things are kept, after all," Sarah smirked, thinking she had won. She didn't notice the way my eyes lingered on the safe hidden behind the painting in the hallway, the one containing the original deed she thought had been lost in the transition. "Tomorrow then," Sarah said, standing up. "Try not to bring too much clutter. We want to keep the aesthetic clean." I watched them walk away, their footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors I had polished with my own hands when we were starting out. I sat in the gathering shadows, the silence returning, heavier now. They wanted me in the dark. They had no idea I was about to turn the lights out on them. The basement stairs creaked under my weight, a sound I hadn't heard in years. It was a rhythmic groan, like the house itself was complaining about what was happening. I carried a single, small box, the one containing my husband Arthur's journals and the original blueprints of this estate. As I reached the bottom, the air turned cool and smelled of damp earth and forgotten time. Sarah hadn't lied. They had finished the space. The walls were a sterile, blinding white. The floors a cold gray laminate that felt cheap beneath my slippers. It looked like a gallery with nothing to display. I sat on the edge of the narrow cot they had prepared for me and let my mind wander back 30 years. Arthur and I didn't start in a villa. We started in a one-bedroom apartment where the heater rattled and the windows leaked. I was the one who kept the books for his fledgling construction firm while he was out on the sites until midnight. I was the one who skipped meals so we could buy the high-grade timber for our first major contract. I wasn't just his wife. I was the silent architect of his success. When we finally built this house, Arthur had insisted on the grand suite upstairs. For the Queen of the Empire, he had said, kissing my hand. Now, his son, our son, stood in the kitchen above me, probably pouring a glass of the vintage Bordeaux I had bought for Arthur's 60th birthday. I heard Sarah's muffled laughter through the floorboards. She had entered our lives 3 years ago like a whirlwind of silk and expensive perfume. She saw the wealth, the prestige, and the aging widow who seemed like an easy obstacle to bypass. Mark was blinded. He saw her ambition as modern energy, failing to realize that her energy was a vacuum, sucking the history and soul out of everything it touched. I opened Arthur's journal. On the first page, in his rugged handwriting, it read, "The strength of a structure isn't in its walls, but in the ground it stands upon." Sarah thought she was standing on a gold mine she had inherited by marriage. She didn't realize she was standing on sand. She saw me as a relic, a ghost haunting the lower levels. She didn't know that every contractor in this city still remembered my name, not Mark's. She didn't know that the wellness studio she was so eager to build was technically being built on property she didn't legalistically touch. I ran my fingers over the cold laminate floor. They wanted me to manage the household staff? Fine, I would manage. I would watch. I would be the ghost they created. A heavy thud came from upstairs, the sound of furniture being dragged across my old room. My heart tightened, a sharp, physical pinch. That was my mother's vanity desk they were moving. I didn't cry. Instead, I stood up and walked to the corner of the basement, where a small, unassuming metal door was built into the foundation. Behind it sat the master shutoff valves for the entire estate's irrigation and smart home system, a system I had helped program. "Efficiency, Sarah," I whispered into the dark. "You'll learn exactly what that word means." The battle lines weren't drawn in the sunlight of the upper floors. They were drawn right here, in the cold, quiet dark of the foundation. The basement stairs creaked under my weight, a sound I hadn't heard in years. It was a rhythmic groan, like the house itself was complaining about what was happening. I carried a single small box, the one containing my husband Arthur's journals and the original blueprints of this estate. As I reached the bottom, the air turned cool and smelled of damp earth and forgotten time. Sarah hadn't lied. They had finished the space. The walls were a sterile, blinding white, the floors a cold gray laminate that felt cheap beneath my slippers. It looked like a gallery with nothing to display. I sat on the edge of the narrow cot they had prepared for me and let my mind wander back 30 years. Arthur and I didn't start in a villa. We started in a one-bedroom apartment where the heater rattled and the windows leaked. I was the one who kept the books for his fledgling construction firm while he was out on the sites until midnight. I was the one who skipped meals so we could buy the high-grade timber for our first major contract. I wasn't just his wife. I was the silent architect of his success. When we finally built this house, Arthur had insisted on the grand suite upstairs. "For the Queen of the Empire," he had said, kissing my hand. Now, his son, our son, stood in the kitchen above me, probably pouring a glass of the vintage Bordeaux I had bought for Arthur's 60th birthday. I heard Sarah's muffled laughter through the floorboards. She had entered our lives 3 years ago like a whirlwind of silk and expensive perfume. She saw the wealth, the prestige, and the aging widow who seemed like an easy obstacle to bypass. Mark was blinded. He saw her ambition as modern energy, failing to realize that her energy was a vacuum, sucking the history and soul out of everything it touched. I opened Arthur's journal. On the first page, in his rugged handwriting, it read, "The strength of a structure isn't in its walls, but in the ground it stands upon." Sarah thought she was standing on a gold mine she had inherited by marriage. She didn't realize she was standing on sand. She saw me as a relic, a ghost haunting the lower levels. She didn't know that every contractor in this city still remembered my name, not Mark's. She didn't know that the wellness studio she was so eager to build was technically being built on property she didn't legalistically touch. I ran my fingers over the cold laminate floor. They wanted me to manage the household staff? Fine, I would manage. I would watch. I would be the ghost they created. A heavy thud came from upstairs, the sound of furniture being dragged across my old room. My heart tightened, a sharp, physical pinch. That was my mother's vanity desk they were moving. I didn't cry. Instead, I stood up and walked to the corner of the basement, where a small, unassuming metal door was built into the foundation. Behind it sat the master shutoff valves for the entire estate's irrigation and smart home system, a system I had helped program. Efficiency, Sarah, I whispered into the dark. You'll learn exactly what that word means. The battle lines weren't drawn in the sunlight of the upper floors. They were drawn right here, in the cold, quiet dark of the foundation. The transition was swifter than I had anticipated. By the third day, the guest suite upstairs, the one with the velvet curtains and the view of the rose garden I had spent a decade tending, had been gutted. The sounds of hammering and the shrill whine of power saws echoed through the vents, vibrating down into my basement sanctuary. Sarah had wasted no time. She moved with a frantic, hungry energy, replacing my mahogany bookshelves with minimalist glass racks and swapping the warm, amber glow of my lamps for harsh, sterile LED strips. She wasn't just renovating, she was exercising. She wanted every trace of my influence, every whisper of the woman who built this life, scrubbed clean. I spent my mornings in the kitchen, a space that used to smell of cinnamon and roasting garlic. Now, it smelled of green juice and expensive cleaning chemicals. As per Sarah's suggestion, I had taken over the management of the domestic staff. Maria, our housekeeper of 12 years, looked at me with tear-filled eyes as I handed her the new weekly schedule Sarah had drafted. "Mrs. Eleanor," Maria whispered, her voice trembling as she glanced toward the hallway to ensure Sarah wasn't listening. "This schedule, she has us working until 10 every night, and she told me I am to report to her directly if you interfere with the decor." I reached out and squeezed Maria's hand. My skin felt like parchment against hers. "Just do as she says, Maria. For now, keep the floors polished and the silver shining. I'll handle the rest." I watched Sarah from the kitchen island as she walked through the foyer, barking orders into her Bluetooth earpiece. She looked like a queen who had just conquered a small, insignificant province. She treated the house like a stage set for her social media, moving vases an inch to the left, then an inch to the right, capturing the perfect shot of her blessed life. But I saw the cracks she was too vain to notice. I saw the way the new contractors looked at her with thinly veiled annoyance because she didn't understand the first thing about load-bearing walls or electrical circuits. I saw the way Mark looked at the credit card statements she left carelessly on the counter, his face paling, a vein in his temple pulsing with a rhythmic, desperate beat. Mark was drowning, and Sarah was the weight around his neck, draped in pearls. One evening, I was in the garden, clipping a few late-season roses to bring some life into my basement room. The air was crisp, smelling of autumn and wood smoke. "Eleanor," Sarah's voice sliced through the twilight. She was standing on the terrace, wrapped in a cashmere shawl that I had bought for myself in Paris years ago. She didn't even ask to borrow it. She simply took it from the hall closet. "Yes, Sarah?" I stood up, the thorns of the rose bush catching on my gardening gloves. "Those roses are for the centerpieces for next week's charity gala," she said, her voice dripping with an artificial sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "Please don't waste them on, well, downstairs. It's not like anyone is going to see them there." I looked down at the deep red bloom in my hand. It was a mister. Lincoln Rose Arthur's favorite. "The soil here needs more nitrogen, Sarah. If you don't feed the roots, the flowers will wither before your gala even begins." She let out a short, dismissive puff of air. "I have a professional landscaper coming on Monday. I think we're going to replace these old bushes with something more architectural. Boxwoods, maybe. Something clean." Clean. She wanted a life that was clean, sharp, and empty. She didn't realize that a garden, like a family, needs dirt and history to grow. I walked past her toward the basement entrance, the single rose clutched in my hand. As I passed, I caught the scent of my own perfume on her, the vintage Chanel I kept for special occasions. She was wearing my clothes, my jewels, and my husband's legacy like a costume. That night, in the quiet of the basement, I sat at my small desk. The light from my single lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the white walls. I pulled out a leather-bound ledger. It wasn't just a diary. It was a record of every investment, every deed, and every debt this family had ever incurred. Sarah thought she was the one holding the gavel. She didn't realize she was just a guest in a house that was already deciding it didn't want her there. I looked at the rose in the glass of water. It was beautiful, but its time in this house was coming to an end, just like hers. The air conditioning in the villa was humming a low, expensive vibration that felt like it was sucking the soul out of the rooms. Tonight was the pre-gala dinner. Sarah had invited her elite circle, boutique owners, socialites, and a couple of Mark's potential investors. I was in the kitchen, dressed in my simple black silk blouse, the one Arthur bought me for our silver anniversary. I was plating the appetizers, my hands steady as I arranged the smoked salmon with surgical precision. I wasn't a guest tonight. I was the facilitator. "Eleanor, the Pinot Grigio isn't chilled enough." Sarah swept into the kitchen, her voice a sharp whip. She looked stunning in a dress that cost more than my first car, but her beauty was like a glass sculpture, sharp and hollow. "And for heaven's sake, put on an apron. You look too much like a guest, and it's confusing the help." I looked at her, my reflection caught in the polished chrome of the refrigerator. "I am not the help, Sarah. I am the host who built this kitchen." She leaned in, the scent of her perfume, my perfume cloying and thick. "Not anymore. In this house, you're a resident of the lower level. Let's keep the roles clear tonight, shall we? For Mark's sake." The dinner was a blur of superficial laughter and the clinking of crystal. I moved through the shadows of the dining room, refilling water glasses, clearing plates. I was a ghost in my own history. Mark never looked at me, not once. He laughed at the jokes of men who didn't know his father's name, and he toasted to a future built on my silence. The breaking point came during the dessert course. "Oh, Sarah, this house is just divine." One of the women cooed, gesturing to the sprawling layout. "It must have been so difficult to modernize such an old-fashioned estate." Sarah leaned back, swirling her wine. "It was a nightmare, honestly. We had to clear out so much clutter. And of course, there's the living clutter." She let out a light, tinkling laugh that made my blood run cold. She looked directly at me as I was clearing a bread plate. "We've had to be very firm about boundaries. We even had to move Eleanor to the basement just to keep the aesthetic cohesive. She's much happier there, really. It's closer to her. Duties." The table went quiet for a heartbeat. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. I felt the heat rise to my neck, not out of shame, but out of a cold, crystalline clarity. "Mark?" I said softly. The name felt heavy in my mouth. My son finally looked up. His eyes were glassy, shielded by the cowardice of a man who had sold his spine for a lifestyle he couldn't afford. "Mom, please, not now. Sarah is just joking." "Is she?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo louder than the music. "Eleanor, that's enough," Sarah snapped, her face flushing with sudden irritation. "You've forgotten the napkins for the dessert. Go downstairs and bring up the linen ones, the plain ones. We don't want your dusty lace on this table." I looked at the table of people strangers eating off my china, drinking my wine, mocking my life. I looked at my son, who watched his mother be treated like a disgraced servant, and chose to take another sip of wine. I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I simply placed the plate down. "I'll go to the basement, Sarah," I said, my voice eerily calm. "But remember, the basement is where the foundation lives. If you disturb the foundation too much, the whole house tends to come crashing down." I walked away, leaving the room in a suffocating silence. As I descended the stairs into the dark, the sounds of their renewed laughter followed me, muffled by the floorboards. They thought they had finally put me in my place. They didn't realize that from the dark, I could see everything they were doing in the light. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't feeling sad. I was feeling dangerous. The basement was a cathedral of shadows. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I knew every inch of this foundation, every secret conduit and hidden corner. The muffled thumping of music and the shrill, artificial laughter from the dinner party above leaked through the ceiling, sounding like a world that was already starting to rot. I sat at my small, utilitarian desk, my heart still echoing the cold dismissal in Mark's eyes. But I wasn't just sitting there in self-pity. I was listening. Because of the way Arthur had built the HVAC system, the vents acted like a natural stethoscope for the house. If you sat in the corner of the basement, near the main air return, you could hear whispers from the master suite as if they were being spoken directly into your ear. "It's done, Mark. Stop whining about it." Sarah's voice floated down, stripped of its socialite charm. She sounded sharp, predatory. "She's my mother, Sarah," Mark's voice followed, weak and strained. Moving her to the basement was one thing, but the paperwork. If she finds out we've used the estate as collateral for the bridge loan, she'll lose it. I froze. My hand, reaching for my glasses, stopped midair. Collateral? She won't find out, Sarah snapped. The woman can barely navigate her own smartphone. She thinks the deed is still in that dusty old safe in the library. She doesn't realize that when you signed those medical proxies last year, you gave us the keys to the kingdom. By the time she realizes the villa is technically owned by the holding company, we'll have flipped the tech investment and paid it back. We just need her to stay, quiet, and out of the way. A heavy silence followed. I waited, praying for my son to defend the roof over our heads, to defend his father's legacy. The investment better pay off, Mark finally muttered. If the bank realizes the secondary signature was forged by your assistant, it's not forgery, it's expediting, Sarah laughed, a cold, dry sound. Besides, what's she going to do? Sue her only son? She has nowhere else to go. We are her world, Mark. She'll swallow whatever we give her because she's afraid of being alone. I leaned back in my chair, the darkness of the basement feeling like a protective shroud. My breath came in slow, icy exhales. They hadn't just insulted me. They had committed a crime against the very soil we stood on. They had leveraged the house Arthur and I built on sweat and sacrifice to fund Sarah's delusions of grandeur. And they had used my own trust, my love for my son, to forge the nails for my coffin. I looked at the small metal safe in the corner of my basement room. Sarah thought the important papers were in the library upstairs. She was right, there were papers there. But they were copies. The original deed, the one with the ironclad trust clause that Arthur and I had set up with our attorneys 30 years ago, was never in the library. It was right here, under a pile of old photo albums. A clause that stated, in the event of any unauthorized encumbrance or attempted sale of the property by a secondary beneficiary, the title immediately reverts to the primary owner with a notice to vacate, triggered for all other occupants. They thought I was afraid of being alone. They didn't realize that after 40 years of building a legacy, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was the dark. I reached into the back of my drawer and pulled out a burner phone I had purchased months ago, just in case. I dialed a number I hadn't called since Arthur's funeral. "Hello, Julian?" I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's blade. "It's Eleanor. I think it's time we look at that contingency plan Arthur and I discussed." "Yes, the nuclear one." Upstairs, the party reached its crescendo. Below, in the dark, the foundation began to shift. The last echoes of the party guests' car engines faded into the distance, leaving the estate in a silence that felt bruised. I lay on the narrow cot in the basement, the thin sheets smelling of detergent and abandonment. The cold here wasn't just a matter of temperature, it was a physical weight, pressing down from the layers of concrete and the even heavier layers of betrayal above me. I pulled a knitted wool shawl, one I had made years ago, while waiting for Arthur to come home from a late shift, tightly around my shoulders. My bones ached, a dull throb that reminded me I was 65, not 25. But my mind had never been sharper. Sarah had turned off the main heating for the lower levels to save on utilities, she had claimed. I knew better. It was a test. She wanted to see how much I would endure before I begged to come back upstairs, before I surrendered the last of my pride, just for a bit of warmth. She didn't know that I had survived winters in unheated trailers when Arthur and I were first starting our business. She didn't know that the cold was an old friend of mine. It keeps you awake. It keeps you focused. In the dim glow of my small desk lamp, I began to work. I didn't need a computer. I had my ledgers and my memory. I started cross-referencing the dates Sarah had mentioned upstairs with the bank statements I had quietly intercepted from the mail weeks ago. The bridge loan they had taken out was predatory. They had mortgaged the very soul of this house to invest in a tech startup that, according to the financial journals I read every morning, was already hemorrhaging cash. Mark was playing a game he didn't understand, led by a woman who thought a luxury lifestyle was a birthright, not something earned. Around 3 a.m., the ceiling creaked. Heavy footsteps, Mark. I heard him pacing in the kitchen directly above my head. I could almost visualize him, glass of scotch in hand, staring at the dark garden, feeling the walls of his own lies closing in. He was my son, my only child. A part of me wanted to run up those stairs, wrap my arms around him, and tell him I could fix it. But I stayed still. To save him now would be to nourish the parasite that was destroying him. I looked at the photos on my desk, Arthur, young and sunburnt, standing in front of the skeletal frame of this house. He had built this place to be a fortress for our family. He had put my name on the primary deed not out of sentiment, but because he knew I was the one with the iron will. "You're the anchor, Eleanor," he used to say. "Without you, we all drift away." I reached out and touched the cold basement wall. Sarah thought she had demoted me to the cellar. She thought she had put me in a cage. But you don't put the architect in the cellar and expect the house to stand. I picked up my pen and began to write a letter. Not to Mark, not to Sarah, but to the bank's compliance officer, Julian, an old friend who knew exactly whose signature carried the weight of law in this family. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the tiny, high basement window, I didn't feel tired. I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. The guest was about to remind the owners whose house this really was. The cold didn't bother me anymore. I was becoming part of it. The basement window, a narrow slit of glass at ground level, caught the first light of dawn. I watched the dust motes dancing in the pale beam, realizing that for years I had ignored this part of the house. I had been too busy living in the grand rooms upstairs to remember what held them up. Sarah's renovation had been superficial. She had painted the walls and replaced the floors, but she hadn't touched the old built-in cedar closet in the far corner, the one she claimed smelled too much like old people. I stood up, my knees popping in the silence, and walked toward it. I didn't need a key. I knew the trick to the latch. Arthur had designed it himself. A simple push on a knot in the wood, and the false back of the closet clicked open. Inside lay a heavy, metal box. It wasn't fancy. It was scarred with scratches and a bit of rust, but as I pulled it out, it felt heavier than gold. I sat back on my narrow cot and opened it. There, among the yellowed photographs and the lock of Mark's baby hair, sat a legal envelope that Sarah and Mark didn't know existed. It was Arthur's in case of silence letter, a document we had drafted with our private attorney when we first suspected that wealth might change our son. I unfolded the paper. Arthur's scent, cedarwood, and old paper seemed to rise from the ink. The document wasn't a will. It was a reversionary deed. It stated that while the property could be managed by our heirs, the ownership remained in a private trust that required my biometric signature for any transfer, loan, or structural change. Most importantly, it contained a dignity clause. If the primary resident me was ever mistreated or displaced from their primary quarters without written consent, the trust would automatically trigger a liquidation process. I read the words again. Liquidation. If I chose to sign the papers in this box, the bank would be forced to freeze every account associated with this estate. The bridge loan Mark and Sarah had taken out would be called in immediately. The villa would be put on the market, and the proceeds would go to a charity of my choosing, leaving only a modest stipend for Mark controlled by me. Sarah thought she was moving me to the basement to hide me. Instead, she had sent me directly to the place where I kept the power to erase her world. I looked up at the ceiling. I could hear the faint sound of Sarah's alarm going off. In a few minutes, she would be upstairs, sipping her expensive coffee, looking at her yoga studio plans, and feeling like the Queen of Greenwich. She didn't know that she was currently trespassing in a house that no longer belonged to her. A new kind of warmth spread through my chest. It wasn't the warmth of the heater she had turned off. It was the warmth of a woman who had finally stopped being a mother long enough to remember she was an architect. I picked up my pen. My hand didn't shake. I signed the first document, the one that notified the trust of a violation of dignity. "The basement is finished, Sarah," I whispered, the words tasting like iron. "But the foundation is just waking up." I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just needed to wait for the banks to open at 9 a.m. The house was vibrating. It wasn't the steady, structural hum of the past, but the chaotic, thumping bass of a brand launch party Sarah had organized on a whim. She was launching a lifestyle blog, ironically titled The Modern Matriarch. From my position in the kitchen, I watched the parade of influencers and local socialites. They drifted through the rooms like colorful, hollow birds, leaving trails of expensive perfume and vapid compliments. Sarah was in her element, draped in a white silk jumpsuit that made her look like a saint of modern minimalism. "Eleanor, there you are," she said, cornering me near the service pantry. She didn't look at me. She looked through me, her eyes scanning for any smudge on the silver trays. We're running low on the artisan goat cheese tartlets, and the caterers are busy with the main course. Go down to the cold storage and bring up 3 more crates. Now. I am currently overseeing the wine service, Sarah, I replied, my voice a steady, low anchor amidst the noise. She leaned in close, her smile remaining fixed for the cameras, but her eyes flashed with a sharp, ugly light. You are currently doing whatever I tell you to do if you want to keep that cot in the basement. Do you understand? You're lucky I'm even letting you be seen in the kitchen. Now, move. You're ruining the flow of the room. I stood my ground for a second too long, watching the way her jaw tightened. She was so sure of her dominion. The flow of the room, I repeated softly. You should be careful, Sarah. When you change the flow of a house too quickly, you create a vacuum. Things tend to get sucked in. She let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. Spare me the metaphors, Eleanor. Just get the cheese. I spent the next hour acting as a shadow. I carried crates, I wiped spills, I moved through the crowd like a ghost. I saw Mark in the corner, looking increasingly pale as he checked his phone every 5 minutes. The bridge loan was likely being called in, or perhaps the tech startup had just announced its bankruptcy. The sweat on his brow told me the foundation of his sandcastle was already beginning to dissolve. The climax of her arrogance came during the toast. Sarah stood on the grand staircase, the one Arthur and I had hand-carved from reclaimed oak, and clinked her glass for silence. I want to thank you all for being here, she beamed. This house is a symbol of what happens when you combine tradition with a bold, modern vision. It wasn't easy to cleanse the old energy, but look at us now. The crowd cheered. Sarah looked down at me, standing near the kitchen door with a tray of empty glasses. She pointed a manicured finger. And a special thanks to Eleanor, our household coordinator. She's been so helpful with the transition to the lower-level living. It's important to know your place in a growing empire, don't you think? A smattering of polite, confused laughter followed. I felt the eyes of the room on me, some pitying, some indifferent. Mark turned his back, unable to watch, yet unwilling to speak. I didn't lower my head. I didn't flush with shame. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my apron and felt the small, cold vibration of my burner phone. A text from Julian had just arrived. Documents filed. Execution at midnight. I looked up at Sarah on her high perch. I offered her the smallest, most enigmatic smile she had ever seen. You're right, Sarah, I said, my voice carrying through the sudden lull in music. It is very important to know exactly where you stand, especially when the floor is about to move. She frowned, her perfection momentarily flickering. What is that supposed to mean? It means, I said, turning back toward the kitchen, that the cheese tartlets are served. Enjoy them. They might be the last thing you taste in this house. I walked away, the weight of the nuclear option in my pocket feeling lighter than air. The escalation was over. The collapse was about to begin. The ballroom, once my sanctuary of quiet evenings, was now a battlefield of egos. The smell of expensive lilies and floor wax was suffocating. I stood by the buffet table, my hands clasped behind my back, watching Sarah hold court. She was surrounded by the big players. The bank executives Mark was desperate to impress, and the local journalists she was using to build her brand. Mark looked like a man walking a tightrope in a hurricane. Every time his phone buzzed, he flinched. He knew the bridge loan was a ticking time bomb, but Sarah? She was too busy being the star of her own movie to hear the countdown. Eleanor, more champagne for Mr. Sterling, Sarah called out, her voice cutting through the jazz music. She didn't look at me. She just snapped her fingers like I was a poorly trained retriever. I walked over with the silver tray. Mr. Sterling, an old associate of Arthur's, looked at me with a flicker of recognition, then a deep, settling frown. Eleanor, is that you? I thought you were in Europe. Before I could answer, Sarah stepped in, her hand resting dismissively on my shoulder. Oh, Eleanor is our little live-in project. She's found she much prefers the simplicity of the basement. It keeps her out of the way of the busy work of running an estate like this. Don't mind her, she's just here to help with the service tonight. Mr. Sterling's face hardened. He looked at Mark, then back at me. The silence at the table became a cold, physical thing. Then, it happened. Sarah, perhaps emboldened by the wine or the silence, reached out and took a glass from my tray. As she did, she deliberately tipped it, A cascade of vintage crystal poured down the front of my black silk blouse, the one Arthur bought me. The room went quiet. I felt the cold liquid seep into the fabric, chilling my skin. "Oh, Eleanor," Sarah gasped, a mock-pitying pout on her lips that didn't hide the gleam of malice in her eyes. "You're getting so clumsy in your old age. This is why we can't have you upstairs during the day. You're becoming a liability to the aesthetic. Why don't you go back to your room and try to be invisible for the rest of the night? You're embarrassing, Mark." Mark didn't move. He didn't offer me a napkin. He didn't tell her she had gone too far. He just stared at his shoes, a broken man in a bespoke suit. I didn't flinch. I didn't wipe the champagne from my chest. I looked Sarah dead in the eye, a gaze honed by decades of business meetings and life's hardest lessons. "The only thing embarrassing about this room, Sarah," I said, my voice low and perfectly modulated, "is the fact that you think you own the air you're breathing. You're so busy looking at the aesthetic that you've forgotten to look at the fine print." "Excuse me?" Sarah's laugh was high and brittle. "I think the champagne has gone to your head, Eleanor. Go. To the basement. Now." I leaned in, just an inch. "I'm going. But keep your eyes on your phone, Sarah. I believe Mr. Sterling's bank just sent out a very important notification. It seems there's been a change in management." I turned and walked away, my back straight, my head held high. I could hear the whispers starting behind me. I could hear Mr. Sterling's voice, sharp and demanding. I didn't stop until I reached the basement door. As I descended into the dark, I felt the first vibration of the nuclear strike. The music upstairs stuttered, then stopped. The humiliation was over. The eviction had begun. I didn't go to the basement to hide. I went to change. I stripped off the champagne-soaked blouse and reached into the back of the cedar closet. I pulled out a suit I hadn't worn since Arthur's memorial, a deep, midnight navy wool, tailored to perfection. I pinned a single brooch to my lapel. The diamond phoenix Arthur gave me when we landed our first $1 million contract. I didn't look like a household coordinator. I looked like the woman who owned the city. Upstairs, the music had died a jagged death. As I climbed the stairs, the silence was thick, punctured only by the frantic tapping of fingers on glass. Sarah was standing in the center of the foyer, her face the color of dry chalk, staring at her phone. Mark was beside her, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the back of a chair. It's a mistake," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "The accounts are frozen. The bank says the property is in involuntary liquidation status. Mark, do something." "I can't," Mark choked out. "The primary trustee just revoked the proxy. Everything is locked." I stepped into the light of the chandelier. The guests, frozen in small groups, turned to look at me. The whispers stopped. I wasn't the ghost in the basement anymore. I was the storm. "It's not a mistake, Sarah," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings I had chosen 30 years ago. She spun around, her eyes widening in a mixture of rage and terror. "You! What did you do? You've ruined us! Mark, tell her to fix it!" I walked past her, directly to Mr. Sterling and the other executives. I didn't need to introduce myself. They stood up instinctively. I handed Mr. Sterling the original, notarized reversionary deed from my basement box. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my tone as cold and precise as a diamond cutter, "as the primary trustee of the Arthur Vance estate, I am notifying you that the dignity clause has been violated. The unauthorized bridge loan against this property is now void, and the secondary signatories, my son and his wife, are being removed from the trust effective immediately." The room gasped. Sarah's white jumpsuit suddenly looked like a shroud. "You can't do this," she screamed, lunging toward me. "I am the face of this house. I am the modern vision. You're just an old woman who sleeps in the dark." I didn't flinch. I let her get close enough to see the lack of fear in my eyes. "The dark is where I learned to see, Sarah. You were so busy looking at the aesthetic that you forgot the most basic rule of architecture. A house is only as strong as its foundation. And you've spent the last 6 months trying to crack mine." I turned to my son. He looked small, diminished. "Mark, I stayed in that basement to see if any part of the man I raised was still in there, to see if you would remember who actually built the life you're so carelessly throwing away." "Mom, He couldn't finish. "The party is over," I said, looking out at the crowd of strangers. "The staff will be paid a 3-month bonus and released tonight." The movers will be here at 8 a.m. tomorrow to clear out everything that isn't original to the house. That includes your yoga studio, Sarah, and it includes you. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence that followed was my greatest victory. I wasn't just taking back my house. I was taking back my name. The gala guests vanished like smoke in a gale, leaving behind half-eaten appetizers and a deafening silence. The villa, which hours ago was a stage for Sarah's vanity, now felt like what it truly was, a hollow shell. Sarah was collapsed on the velvet sofa, the one she had bought to replace my favorite armchair. Her mascara was smudged, tracking dark, ugly lines down her face. She wasn't a modern matriarch anymore. She was a trespasser who had just been caught. "You can't do this, Eleanor," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and remaining venom. "We have a life here. I have a brand. My followers. The press. What will they say if I'm thrown out like a common squatter? Your brand, Sarah, was built on a foundation of theft and my silence," I said, standing by the fireplace, my shadow long and imposing on the floor. "As for your followers, I suspect they'll find a story about a failed socialite far more engaging than a fake yoga studio." Mark sat at the dining table, his head buried in his hands. He looked broken, but for the first time in years, he looked honest. "I just wanted to make it work, Mom. I thought if I gave her what she wanted, the business would follow. I didn't think it would go this far." "You didn't think because you stopped feeling, Mark," I replied, my voice softening but remaining firm. "You watched your mother be moved to a basement like an old trunk, and you said nothing. You didn't just mortgage the house, you mortgaged your soul. And the Bank of Life has called in your debt." The phone rang. It was the security gate. The lawyers I had hired months ago were here, along with a private security team to ensure the transition happened tonight. Sarah jumped up, her eyes wild. "Mark, tell them to go away. Tell her you're the heir. This house is yours." Mark looked up, his eyes red and hollow. "It's not, Sarah. It never was. I was just a guest who forgot his manners. And now, the host wants her home back." I watched as Sarah began to scream, a primal, ugly sound that echoed through the hallways. She began grabbing things, a crystal vase, a silk throw, as if she could take the soul of the house with her in a suitcase. My security team stepped in, their presence calm and immovable. "You have 1 hour to pack your personal clothing, Sarah," I said, turning my back on her. "Anything that was purchased with the funds from that illegal bridge loan stays here. It belongs to the trust now." As they were escorted toward the stairs, the same stairs Sarah had used to look down on me, I felt a strange sense of exhaustion, but no regret. Greed is a fire that eventually consumes its own house. I was just the one who refused to let the fire spread to the foundation. The house began to feel quiet again. A clean, cold quiet. The sun rose over Greenwich with a clarity that felt like a fresh start. The movers had come and gone, taking with them the glass tables, the sterile LED lights, and the white silk pillows that had tried so hard to erase the soul of this home. I stood in the center of the grand suite upstairs, my suite. The morning light flooded through the windows, illuminating the dust motes that had finally settled. The house was quiet again, not the suffocating silence of the basement, but the peaceful stillness of a sanctuary. Mark stood at the door, a single suitcase by his side. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask to stay. He just looked at me with the eyes of the boy I once knew, before ambition and a hollow marriage blinded him. "Where will you go?" I asked, my voice soft but devoid of the old motherly urge to protect him from his own mistakes. "A small apartment near the city," he said. "I have a job interview for a junior management position. It's a start, Mom, a real one." I nodded. The foundation of a life, Mark, is built on honesty. It's harder than building with sand, but it's the only thing that stands when the storms come. He lowered his head, walked toward me, and for the first time in years, he hugged me. It was brief, hesitant, and heavy with regret. Then, he walked away. I watched his car disappear down the long, winding driveway until the iron gates swung shut with a definitive, metallic click. I walked back down to the basement one last time. I didn't go to mourn the cold or the darkness. I went to pick up Arthur's journals and the old family photo albums. As I climbed the stairs back into the light, I realized that I didn't want this big, empty villa anymore. It was a monument to a past that had already been served. I picked up the phone and called Julian. "The liquidation, Julian. Proceed with the sale of the estate. All of it." And the proceeds, Eleanor? He asked. Set up a foundation in Arthur's name, I said, looking at the rose garden through the window. For widows who have been displaced from their homes, I want to build something that can't be stolen by a signature or a lie. As for me, I'm moving into a cottage by the coast. It's small, with a porch that faces the Atlantic. It has no basement. I sat at the mahogany table, poured myself a fresh cup of tea, hot this time, and watched the steam rise. I thought about Sarah, who was likely currently frantically explaining her rebranding to a world that had already moved on. I thought about Mark, who was finally learning the value of $1. I am Eleanor Vance. I spent months in the dark, and in that darkness, I found a version of myself that didn't need a grand house to be powerful. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I didn't need to fight to win. I simply stood my ground until the sand shifted and the truth remained. I took a sip of my tea. It was perfect.